Lecture number 2, The Four Noble Truths. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. With this talk, we turn from the Buddha to his teaching. The Buddha's teaching is called the Dhamma. The word Dhamma comes from the Pali root dara, which means to support, to sustain, to hold up. The word Dhamma has several shades of meaning. In its most basic sense, the word Dhamma signifies the true nature of things. The Dhamma is the fundamental element of lawfulness operating in the universe, structuring all events, all experience, all phenomena. And all actual things, all phenomena, are called Dhammas in the plural, because all of them embody, incorporate the true nature of things. The word Dhamma also means the ethical law, the fundamental principle of righteousness, the cosmic law of virtue and goodness. Dhamma also has a practical sense, something applicable to our own life. Dhamma is that which sustains us, which supports us, which upholds our own efforts to live in virtue and goodness. In this sense, Dhamma is the path. On one hand, it's the lower path of ethical virtue, which harmonizes with the cosmic moral law. Then also Dhamma is the supramundane path, the higher path, that leads to the realization of the true nature of things, that brings the attainment of truth. The word Dhamma also applies to the Buddha's teaching. The Buddha's teaching is called the Dhamma because this teaching makes known clearly, explicitly, perfectly the true self-subsistent Dhamma, the true nature of things. Now, in approaching the Dhamma, it is necessary to come to it with the right attitude, with the right frame of mind, with the right understanding and right intention. By way of understanding the Dhamma, we should not take it to be a formulated creed, something that demands to be accepted on faith. Also, the Dhamma shouldn't be taken to be just a system of ideas, a set of doctrines, something to be played about with intellectually. The Dhamma, as we said, is essentially a path, a way that leads to the realization of truth. And Dhamma is also the truth that is to be realized in immediate experience. The Buddha's teaching as the Dhamma, as the formulation of Dhamma, involves a number of doctrines and principles. But these are presented to us not as fixed articles of belief, but as pointers, aids to awaken our own understanding, to bring about an opening of our own eyes of wisdom. The various doctrines presented in the Dhamma come out of the Buddha's own experience of enlightenment, not out of speculation, not out of belief, but out of his own realization of truth. And these same doctrines are presented to us with the aim of leading us to the attainment of enlightenment, so that we can share the Buddha's own insight into the true nature of experience. The Dhamma is called Upanayaka. It leads onwards, step by step, to a deepening realization of truth. It's called Niyanika, emancipating, leading to liberation. And where this realization of Dhamma is to take place is within ourselves, in our own experience. The Dhamma is the true nature of things, the truth that's written into our own experience. And this truth has to be seen within our own experience, the same way, with the same immediacy that we can see an object held in the hand. And to realize this truth, we have to travel the path of Dhamma, all by ourselves. There's nobody else that can walk it for us. We've got to walk the path by ourselves. But the formulated Dhamma, the Dhamma taught by the Buddha, guides us in our effort to walk the path. It enables us to see, it points out what has to be understood. It doesn't present us with any neat system of ideas to be admired and discussed. It doesn't let us off with easy answers to the ultimate questions. What it gives us is basically the method, the way to find the answers for ourselves, the way to make our own discovery of truth. The Dharma focuses upon the lived immediacy of human life, upon our own lives. It doesn't start off with any kind of theoretical postulates, any dogmas, any creeds to be believed. It begins with an observation, a simple observation, but one very profound, the gateway to all wisdom. This is the observation that human life is essentially problematic, that is beset with problems, difficulties, inadequacies, what the Buddha calls dukkha, usually translated as suffering. And the value of the Dhamma is pragmatic and instrumental. It offers to show us the way out of our problematic situation, the way to attain inner freedom, to realize the highest and truest happiness. And the Buddha presents the Dhamma as the means to this goal, the method. And he compares the Dhamma to a raft. We use a raft to get from one side of a river to the other, not to worship, not to enshrine, not to put on our head and to carry around with us wherever we go. In the same way, we use the Dhamma as our means, the way to get from our present state of bondage and suffering, of dukkha, to get across to the other shore, the state of absolute freedom, nibbana, the end of suffering. Because of this practical bent, the Buddha dismisses all purely speculative concerns as irrelevant. He says that he teaches only suffering and the cessation of suffering. And all other pursuits, all other philosophical pursuits, he says, are futile, misleading, even dangerous. And the Buddha compares the metaphysician obsessed with his speculations to a man struck by a poisoned arrow. A man is lying, he's been hit by a poisoned arrow, a physician comes to him, offers to remove the arrow, and the man says, "No, I won't let you take out the arrow until you tell me the name of the man who shot me, what class he comes from, what his family is, what kind of material he made the arrow from, what kind of poison he used, what kind of bow he used. Such a man will die before he recovers." In the same way, the Buddha says, the speculative thinker, lost in his questions and his systems of thought, only continues to wallow in suffering without finding the way to liberation. And the Buddha's teaching is presented solely and entirely to give us the way to liberation. Now, the recorded teachings of the Buddha are very numerous, but all of these diverse teachings fit together into a single unifying frame, which is completely consistent, completely coherent. This frame is the teaching of the Four Noble Truths. And the Buddha compares the Four Noble Truths to the footprint of an elephant. And just as the footprint of the elephant can contain the footprints of all the other animals, the footprints of tigers, lions, dogs, cats, bears, deer, all fit into the footprint of the elephant. And so all the different teachings taught by the Buddha fit into this single framework of the Four Noble Truths. This is the key which unifies all the different teachings of the Buddha. It's sometimes believed that the Four Noble Truths form an introductory teaching, the ABCs of Buddhism, preparations for the higher doctrines, for the real deep esoteric stuff. This view, however, is not correct. In the suttas, the Buddha makes it clear that the realization of the Four Noble Truths coincides with the attainment of enlightenment itself. In his first discourse, spoken to his first 5 disciples, when he sets in motion the wheel of Dhamma, the Buddha says that as long as I did not fully understand and penetrate the Four Noble Truths, I didn't claim in this world that I had reached the supreme enlightenment. But when I fully penetrated the Four Noble Truths, then I could claim that I reached the supreme enlightenment. And the teaching of the Four Noble Truths was the special mission of the Buddha. It's called the Samukhangsika Dhamma Desana, the unique Dhamma teaching of an enlightened one. And the Buddha says that just as when the sun and moon haven't appeared in the world, then there's no shining forth of light, no radiance, but only darkness covers the world. And there's no discrimination of the day and night, of the seasons and the years. In the same way, he says, as long as a Buddha doesn't appear in the world, then there's no teaching, no exposition of the Four Noble Truths, but only spiritual blindness and darkness prevails. But when a Buddha arises in the world, that is like the arising of the sun and the moon, shedding great light over the world. When the Buddha appears, then there's a teaching of the Four Noble Truths, the explanation and analysis and exposition of the Four Noble Truths. So the special purpose of the whole Dhamma is to make known the Four Noble Truths. And the special aim of those treading the path to enlightenment is to see for themselves the Four Noble Truths. The Buddha says that as long as we remain blind to the Four Noble Truths, we are lost in ignorance. We roam in samsara, the ocean of birth and death, the round of suffering. But when we awaken to the truths, when we make them a living experience, that is the wisdom of enlightenment. That leads to Nibbana, to the freedom of the liberated mind. Now, before we can realize the Four Noble Truths, we have to understand them. And to understand them, we have to learn what they are. The first Noble Truth is the truth of dukkha. The term dukkha is usually translated as suffering, but as we'll see, the Pali word has a much deeper meaning than this word. The second truth is the truth of the origin of dukkha, the cause of suffering. And this the Buddha identifies as craving or thirst, the blind, self-centered desire. The third noble truth is the truth of the cessation of dukkha, the end of suffering, which the Buddha identifies as Nibbana, the deathless state. And the fourth noble truth is the truth of the path, the way to liberation from dukkha. That is the Noble Eightfold Path. And from this explanation, we can see that the Four Noble Truths actually center around a single theme, a single subject. That is what's called dukkha. And they differ simply in that they treat this theme from 4 different angles. The first truth lays out the problem, the forms of dukkha. The second truth traces the problem to its cause. The third truth gives us the solution. And the fourth truth maps out the means to achieve the solution. Now, since the whole concern of the Four Noble Truths is with the problem of dukkha, our understanding of the Dhamma hinges upon the way we understand this word. Now, the word dukkha has often been translated as suffering, pain, and misery. And while these capture part of its meaning, they also give rise to misconceptions. Part of the problem is the fact that there's no single English word that really does justice to the original Pali word. The Pali word dukkha originally meant pain and suffering, and the Buddha sometimes uses it in this limited sense when he speaks about unpleasant feelings of body and of mind and calls them dukkha vedana, painful feelings. But the Buddha took this word of common usage and he raised it to a higher level, a philosophical level where it expresses a deep and comprehensive vision of human existence. And from this perspective, this higher angle, the word dukkha comes to suggest a basic unsatisfactoriness pervading all existence, all forms of life, due to the fact that all forms of life are changing, impermanent, unstable, without any inner core or substance. The term dukkha thus indicates a lack of perfection in experience, a perpetual gap and unbalance between an ideal state we desire and hope for and envisage and the real state of our existence that we have to put up with, a condition that never really measures up to our standards and expectations. These are the ideas that are suggested by the word dukkha, and these ideas have to be taken into account if we're to understand the Four Noble Truths correctly. Sometimes when we explain the Buddha's teaching, we'll continue to use the common translation suffering, just because this word communicates rather more directly than the Pali word. Other times we'll stick to the Pali. But when we use the English word suffering, we should understand it generally in the deeper, more broader sense given to it by the Buddha, rather than in the limited sense as felt pain or unhappiness. Now something has to be said about each of the words in the phrase Four Noble Truths. Each of these words is significant. First, what is implied by the word satya, truth? The Pali word satya has a different nuance than the English word truth. The English word truth usually means a statement or proposition corresponding to a real state of affairs. Truth is here a verbal formulation or a mental representation of a state of affairs. The Pali word satya means that which is. It indicates an existing reality rather than a true statement or proposition. Thus, the Four Noble Truths are not four propositions, but four actualities, four realities. The first truth is the state of dukkha itself. The second truth is its actual cause, craving. The third truth is its cessation, nibbana. And the fourth truth is the path, the Noble Eightfold Path. The fact that these are truths implies that they are not merely formulations propounded by the Buddha. The four truths are four actualities discovered by the Buddha, found by him, seen by him, quite independent of him. In his first discourse, the Buddha says that on the night of his enlightenment, with respect to the Four Noble Truths, the eye arose, the vision arose, knowledge arose, understanding arose. He gained insight into the truths. He saw them. He penetrated them. This means he didn't create them. When I see, for example, this lamp in front of me, my sight doesn't create the lamp. With my eyes, I just see what is already there. In the same way, the Buddha's enlightenment was a discovery of the Four Noble Truths, not a creation of them. And likewise, in following the path, what we aim to do is to awaken to truth, to the Four Truths, to open our inner eye, the eye of wisdom, so that we can see for ourselves the fundamental realities of human life, the truths which are always present but just hidden from our sight due to the screen of ignorance. Now the truths are called Arya Satya, Noble Truths. And they gain the name Noble Truths for several reasons. We can mention three. The first is that they are the truths taught by the Aryan, the Noble One, that is, by the Buddha. That's the simplest reason. The second reason is that they are the truths that lead to the Aryan state. An Aryan is a noble one. And these are the truths that can transform a person into an Aryan, into a noble one. In Buddhist doctrine, all human beings are divided into two general classes. On the one hand, there are the Putujanas, the ordinary people, the unenlightened people. Even if somebody might be quite extraordinary, but if he still lacks the eye of enlightenment, he's a Buddhujana, an average man, a worldling. On the other hand, there are the Aryans, the noble ones, those who are either fully enlightened or are in the process of awakening, or are definitely on the path to enlightenment. Now, what distinguishes the ordinary people from the Aryans, from the noble ones, is just the realization of these four noble truths. Those who realize them, as soon as they see them, become inwardly transformed. They undergo a spiritual rebirth and become a new kind of man. They leave the ranks of the worldlings, Buddhujanas. They enter the ranks of the noble ones, the Aryans. They become bound for enlightenment, incapable of turning back. Then the third reason the truths are called Aryan truths, the noble truths, is because they call for noble qualities. They call for the courage, the honesty, the wisdom, the profundity of character, to see reality as it is. The truths are just so, not otherwise, real and immutable. Tattva avitatta ananyata. Such as they are, not otherwise, immutable. And those who have the qualities to recognize these truths, these are the true Aryans. Then there are four truths, exactly four truths. And there are exactly four truths because the four together are needed to constitute a definite logical unity, tied together by the tightest bonds. The logic spells out the problem, its source, its solution, and the means to its solution. None of these truths can be removed without destroying the very possibility of liberation, and no other truth has to be added to them. The four are perfectly sufficient in themselves, and they give us everything that we need to gain liberation. The logic of the four truths is exactly the same as the formula a doctor uses to deal with the patient. When the patient comes to a doctor with a certain sickness, the doctor starts off with a diagnosis. That is, he examines the patient, he takes note of his symptoms, and he tries to determine what is the disease the patient is suffering from. This is like the first noble truth. Here the Buddha sets out the basic affliction of human life, the problem of dukkha, suffering. Then, after he makes his diagnosis, the doctor lays down an etiology. He sets out the cause of the disease. This is analogous to the second noble truth. Here the Buddha tracks down the cause of dukkha. He finds it in craving. As a third step, the doctor gives a prognosis. He determines the possibility of a cure, what must be done to remove the disease. This is like the third truth, the cessation of dukkha. Here the Buddha announces, yes, suffering can be ended. Then as a fourth step, the doctor gives a remedy. He prescribes a course of treatment that can remove the disease. This is just what the Buddha does in the fourth noble truth. He prescribes the Noble Eightfold Path. This is the medicine for curing the disease of suffering. Now we will deal with each of the four noble truths individually, examining each in detail. And we start with the first noble truth, the dukkhaṃ arya sacchaṃ, usually translated the noble truth of suffering. And in the suttas, the Buddha explains this first noble truth simply by listing the different forms of dukkha. Here, I'd like to read just from the text, from the usual sutta. He says, what is the noble truth of suffering, or dukkha? Birth is suffering, old age, aging is suffering, disease is suffering, Death is suffering. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are suffering. To be separated from the pleasant is suffering. To be united with the unpleasant is suffering. Not to get what one wants is suffering. In brief, the 5 aggregates of clinging are suffering. So here we have different forms of dukkha. First, birth. Birth technically means the moment of conception, the moment of springing up in the womb. In a more general sense, it means the entire process of gestation, from the moment of conception up to the time of the exit from the womb. And here, birth in itself, when it takes place, it becomes a painful experience. Being thrust out from the womb, thrown out into the world, without any choice, without any understanding. This can be a very dramatic experience. In fact, they speak of the birth trauma. And birth is dukkha also, since this is the foundation, the first point for all the other forms of dukkha that will follow in the course of the lifetime. Then after birth, then growth takes place. Growth, development, this isn't mentioned specifically as a form of dukkha, though of course this also involves its share of pain and suffering. Then when the maximum point of growth is reached, then aging sets in. The hair turns gray, the skin wrinkles, the teeth begin to fall out. The sense faculties lose their sharpness. The mind loses its intelligence, memory grows dimmer, strength and vitality decline. That's the suffering of old age. Then sickness has various forms, ailments of the body, disease, accidents, injuries, and so on. Ailments of the mind, worry, anxiety, neuroses, psychoses. Then at the end comes death, the breakup of the body, the extinguishing of the life force. Death also a form of suffering. These 4 items, birth, old age, sickness, and death, these can be called occasional dukkha, since they come only at certain times. Then the Buddha mentions 5 terms which give a kind of overview of the vocabulary of suffering. Soka parideva dukkha dominasu payasa. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. Sorrow is intense woe because of some deprivation of some kind. Lamentation, that's crying and weeping. Pain is bodily pain. Grief is any kind of mental unhappiness. Then despair, that's the very lowest point of mental anguish, where all hope is given up. Then the Buddha says, union with the unpleasant is dukkha. That is, there are various unpleasant situations we don't want to face, disagreeable people we don't want to associate with, disagreeable things we don't want to meet with. We have to face these situations, people and things. We're thrown into contact with them against our will, and as a result, we meet with suffering. Then there's separation from the pleasant. There are pleasant and agreeable situations we would like to meet with, we hope will last. Pleasant people we want to make contact with, to hold to cling to. Relationships we want to endure. But events follow their own law. They don't conform to our will. And eventually we have to face separation from everyone and everything we cherish. From parents, friends, brothers, sisters, husbands, wives, and children. It takes place separation, and as a result, suffering. Then the Buddha says, not to get what we desire. That is dukkha, that is suffering. Generally, we desire pleasure, wealth, fame, and praise, but instead we meet often with pain, with poverty, with dishonor and blame. As a result of this, there comes suffering. We want to remain young, but we have to grow old. We want to be healthy, but we fall sick. We would like to live forever, but we have to die. Thus, even those types of physical suffering can become types of suffering not getting what one wants. These three, the union with the unpleasant, separation from the pleasant, and not getting what we want, these can be called frequent dukkha, because we meet them quite often in the course of life. Then the Buddha sums up the whole First Noble Truth. He says, in brief, the 5 aggregates of clinging are dukkha. With this statement, the Buddha indicates that all our experience is included in dukkha. And thus, this aspect can be called constant dukkha, continual dukkha. Now we have to understand what are meant by the 5 aggregates of clinging. The 5 aggregates are the basic components of our experience, the basic elements of our existence. We exist as psychophysical organisms, and this organism can be broken down into 5 types of factors. On the one hand, there is the material form. That covers the body, the material body with its sense faculties. That is the physical, the material side of our organism. Then the other 4 aggregates, those cover the mental side. That's the analysis of mind. The mind is analyzed into 4 groups of factors. That is feeling, vedana, the factor by which we feel pleasure, pain, or indifference. Perception, that's the 3rd aggregate, is perception, the factor by which we take note of the properties of objects. The 4th aggregate is the aggregate of mental formation. That is all the mental acts of volition, of will, the different desires, the emotional states, the habitual tendencies of the mind. Then the 5th aggregate is the aggregate of consciousness, vijnana, the basic awareness of an object. So we have the psychophysical organism made up of these 5 aggregates: material form, or the body, and the mind, which is made up of feelings, perceptions, the mental formations, and consciousness. And the reason these are all included in dukkha is that they are all impermanent, changing from moment to moment. In fact, they are only events, momentary events without any inner core, without any substance underlying them, lasting through time. What we call myself, my being, is just a combination, a compound of these 5 insubstantial aggregates, changing from moment to moment. And because our being is always changing without any solid substance inside of it, there is nothing we can hold to in our personalities, in our being, as a basis for lasting happiness. Even though we seek security in the 5 aggregates by clinging to them, by identifying with them, by taking them to be mine, what I truly am, myself, we can never find that security. For the 5 aggregates are just a process, a becoming. And this becoming of the aggregates, this goes on from life to life, continuously. As long as it goes on from life to life, we continue to meet the different forms of suffering. Thus, the aggregates are the basis for all dukkha, for all suffering. It is they that are born, the aggregates that are born, the aggregates grow old, the aggregates fall sick, the aggregates meet pain and sorrow, and eventually die. So the 5 aggregates of clinging are dukkha. Then, to make it clear that dukkha means more than ordinary suffering, that it has this extended sense, the Buddha explains sometimes that there are 3 levels of dukkha. The first and most elementary level is ordinary suffering. This is called dukkha dukkhata. Dukkha as ordinary suffering. This signifies experienced suffering. And this experienced suffering can be either bodily or mental. Bodily pain stands out most clearly in the cases of accident, injury, sickness, in violent contacts with the body. Then there's mental suffering, mental pain. This has a great range from momentary feelings of irritation and annoyance down through deeper experiences of disappointment, of sorrow, grief, frustration, down to the very deepest experiences of anguish, dejection, and despair. All of these are included as forms of mental suffering. So bodily pain and mental pain, these make up dukkha dukkata. Dukkha in the sense of actual felt suffering. But then we come to the second level of dukkha. And this takes us a step further, a step more removed from felt suffering. This is called dukkha due to change, viparinama dukkata. At this level, we see that all our pleasant experience is really a form of dukkha. The reason is that all pleasant experiences are subject to change. The objects that give us pleasure are impermanent. They don't last. And therefore, the pleasure that we get from them is also impermanent. It has to pass away. So when the objects of attachment pass away, because we cling to them and become attached to them, then the result for ourselves is pain and suffering. But this aspect of dukkha due to change, this has to be properly understood. It doesn't mean, as we might think it means, simply that suffering arises through the change of our pleasure. Rather, it means that the pleasant experiences themselves and the things that give pleasure are already dukkha, even while we're enjoying them. And the reason for this is that they're bound to pass away. And because they're going to pass away, even in the immediacy of enjoyment, they're dukkha. Youth has to give way to old age, and therefore, even while we are young, our youthfulness is still dukkha. Health can be undermined by disease, and therefore, even when we're healthy, that state of health is dukkha. And life has to end in death, and therefore life itself becomes dukkha. The third level of dukkha, this takes us to the deepest implications of the truth of suffering, the first noble truth. This is called sankhara dukkata, the dukkha of conditioned formation. The word sankhara here means conditioned formation. This is the aspect of dukkha the Buddha points at when he says the 5 aggregates of clinging are dukkha. The conditioned formations are the 5 aggregates. And these 5 aggregates, as we just explained, are the elements of our being, of our person. What we identify ourselves with, our individually, is simply a combination of conditioned phenomena, mental and material processes undergoing constant transformation. And these 5 aggregates function by themselves. We don't have mastery over them. We don't have absolute control over them. We can't govern them according to our will. They go their own way. They're unstable, impermanent, subject to rise and fall. And because they're in this constant process of rising and falling, for one with deep wisdom, they're experienced as dukkha, unsatisfactory. That is the profound meaning of sankhara dukkata, the unsatisfactoriness of conditioned formation.